Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, at the confluence of two rivers. We are in Des Moines, Iowa, and we are on Iowa Catholic Radio. We are so glad to have you with us, whether that's on air on the Iowa Catholic Radio network, antennae, distributing the show through the airwaves here in central Iowa, iowacatholicradio.com or the Iowa Catholic Radio app, and of course our beautiful, wonderful, healthy, strong, amazing podcast listeners. Thank you for listening to the show. My name is Bo Bonner. I am the mission officer over at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Bud, what do you do? I believe in the same locale.
I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences.
I thought you looked familiar.
Yes, the liberal arts are important to what we're doing at Mercy College, and I head that up.
We want to say thank you to Mercy College of Health Sciences for underwriting our show, mchs.edu. If you want to be in the trustworthy hands of our professors and everybody who is devoted to spreading that healing ministry of the Sisters of Mercy, you will want to go check out Mercy College, mchs.edu.
I'm still basking in the glow of our 125th celebration of the college anniversary. You know, when we went to Rachel and I, the gala celebrating our 125th anniversary, there was a dessert auction, and we won a cake that had like photos of some of the old nursing students. Like,
oh yes,
I don't know if lithographed is the right term. And they were embedded into the cake, so I was reminded of our great legacy and heritage.
They were in fact edible, correct? You were in the spirit of having a good time, and I do know that it in no way prevented us as an organization raising all the money that we wanted to raise in order to be there for student needs. So I think black teeth and all, you were good to go.
Those dessert auctions, they can be intense. You know, the auctioneer's got his cadence up there at the front, and you're sort of anxious, like you might have to go without dessert. But I think our table fared all right. We didn't bid for like any of the top 5 or anything, but
I mean, it's impossible to do when you have hundreds of people, but it would be like even more intriguing. 2 things. One, you had little samples of all the cakes. Ooh. So like you knew which one was really,
delish. And
then I threw this out, but evidently too late. I said we should have made one cake that was gross.
Yeah.
Not like illegal or, health hazard, but just like a cacophony of stuff no one would like together. Like mustard vanilla cake or something like that. And so like you would have impetus to not be the last table either.
You know what would have been really cool is I think it's Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Okay.
You make a cake that's delicious but modestly decorated, and then the most like embellished cake actually tastes gross. And so like if you're like the Nazi who like gravitates towards the beautiful looking thing and thinking like,
oh, you're talking about like, oh yes, so No, this is
this is the
not Raiders of the Lost Ark. This is the Last Chalice. What is it called though?
Indiana Jones and I know it's
Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom, the Holy Grail.
The Holy Grail. I see, but doesn't the Ark of the Covenant show up in the Holy Grail one too?
No. The Ark of the Covenant's the first one, and it melts Nazis' faces. That's true.
Yeah,
but the last one. The guy thinks that the Holy Grail is the really ornate one, but it's actually the simple one.
It's like the simple,
yes.
Man,
I was wondering where Indiana Jones...
I'm glad you contextualized this because there are probably some listeners who were thrown off by that one. What you won't be thrown off by is today's episode.
No, yes, it's going to be on marriage, and it's we're going to swing into that one here pretty quick and not make any jokes about like replacing, a sack of rocks with an artifact and a boulder or anything like that. We promise. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show, whether that be through the airwaves, online at iowacatholicradio.com, on the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or on the places you decide to listen to the podcast. Thank you for being on the show, Bud. So we've been at this for 8 years, and no one yet has told us, get out, which is very nice. So we have been reprising, rethinking through our first run of shows all those 8 years ago when we were talking about the principles of Catholic social teaching. Now, today, I think it's important to note that some of the more studious listeners might have noticed that I would say there's sort of this idea that there needs to be 7 principles of Catholic social teaching. You will then notice that depending on which one you go read, whether that be from the USCCB, you go check out documents on Catholic social teaching from like the Vatican, the 7 aren't necessarily worded the same, and they kind of go in a different order. And then you'll notice, Bud, that the first 2 shows we did on peace and then on justice technically aren't usually listed. So I want to point out that this is an evolving tradition. It's one that in terms of kind of being parsed out is relatively new. Even Rerum Novarum kind of seen as the encyclical that got it all started, although if you read people like Russell Hittinger and others, they'll talk about that there's anticipated documents that went into this. All I'm getting at is there's a lot to Catholic social teaching if you really think about it. And so to clarify, we weren't just going to say there's these 7 that we're doing. We want to talk about the principles that we think undergird that. So although peace and justice very technically are theological terms in general, we talked about them in terms about them undergirding the fabric of Catholic social teaching. We then get into ones like solidarity and subsidiarity, which nearly everyone talks about. It starts to make sense in that sort of, the preferential option for the poor. Today, we're going to talk about one that I think comes up, but sometimes because it's one that people think they got a good read on, I think we miss the social aspect of it, especially in our world because it's seen as at best, if not personal or individual, it's seen as just private, and that is marriage itself. But I'd even say that calling a principle marriage or even defense of marriage, you'll see it's expanded to defense of the family, that all of those things start to, in our world, be seen as defense of the private sphere over against a public one. But the fundamental thing I want to argue is that the first thing that if you learn anything else about marriage and family life for the Catholic Church in terms of Catholic social teaching is that marriage is probably seen as one of the most public things you can talk about in terms of Catholic social teaching. And that marriage, talking about family is not a perfect society. Perfect societies are those societies which have all of their needs met internally. But it's one of the necessary societies that if it's the fundamental building block of any civilization, any society, and without the family, the state can't exist. That to delineate about what all that means and how we go forward is important to keep in mind. But of course, the idea that like marriage and family, and again, going to Scripture first, I think, is good because, again, people think it's too obvious. Like, oh, of course, Catholics think families are good and that marriage is good and it needs defended. But why is it such a necessary aspect of social life that we argue that it's a principle of Catholic social teaching?
Yeah, I think family is a neglected topic in political discourse today.
Which is funny because I think some people would think it's like bandied about far too easily, but I agree with you.
Yeah, I think there are hot button issues that get bandied about, but in general, see, most human beings are all human beings. Like if they get put in a situation where there's like they're facing economic injustice or the threat of violence, they'll be really concerned about that. And those kind of concerns drive our political conversations, our public discourse. So, for instance, things about like wages or, how much groceries cost, et cetera. Sometimes when there's political disagreements, it's like, can't we all agree, like, we want this part of things to run well? In Catholic social teaching, I think some of the best papal encyclicals on this talk about the family as the basic building block of society. And that's not a sentimental claim. It really has to do with just how foundational it is to the human experience. So, yeah, we could go a lot of different directions in this conversation. I think family is our first sort of orientation to the world, so it gives us either a sense of stability or not. And, a lot of times when I tell people I have a show about Catholic social teaching, they'll move to kind of like political conversations in the way that it's keyed sort of like on cable news or something like that. And I try to remind folks that politics is always downstream of culture. And what I mean by that is there's sort of this ecosystem that we reside in And sometimes when things start to go awry, we'll try to like just tweak political outcomes. And we think like, well, if we just vote the right persons into power, like we might be able to get out of this mess that we're in. When really some of the serious issues that we're facing are like way downstream. And we're just kind of like reaping the fruits of like what's been going on for some time. And I think this is clearly the case with the family. I didn't pull like a ton of statistics before we jumped on air today, but all sorts of things about the different outcomes that people experience depending on if they're raised in a home with their biological parents. And whenever we talk about these matters, I should, as a caveat, Bo, like none of this is meant to like shame anyone. We all find ourselves in circumstances, some outside of our control. I know good friends who didn't want their marriage to fall apart, and it did for different reasons. And so it's not to say like, well, if you grew up in a broken home, you're fated for this kind of outcome. But as Catholics, as Christians, as members of a society, we are concerned to uphold the truth of marriage and family because it's just better for people if they have these sort of structures in place.
Absolutely. And I think it's important when we think about, again, Leo XIII, the Pope, who in many ways is considered starting the encyclical tradition in earnest, let's put it that way. Certainly the antecedents, but with him, we get this idea of like a letter that's to be promulgated and teach about the social arrangements of Christianity. So Rerum Novarum, which we've mentioned in earlier shows, and rightfully so, talks about like the new order, right? Like the new way that like work is arising at his time in the 19th century, and what are we going to do about it? But to be quite frank, Leo XIII in some ways is most readily talking about and setting up the discussion of Catholic social teaching in encyclicals like our Arcanum Divinum, right, which is I think the fourth one he ever made, and it is specifically on Christian marriage. And it's not just like these are the rules that you have to do in order to be married in a church. It talks about the defense of marriage in the modern age, to talk about why the church sees it as a fundamental, the fundamental cell of the building block of all other societies. But even when he's talking about something else, like he has an encyclical that's about France and the religious questions in France, and they are many of them, and maybe his strongest arguments are about marriage in France and then education in France. But he has one on dueling and why you shouldn't do duels. Right. And he gets down to it as like it destroys families, right? Like if these, numbskulls are going around like offing each other over honor in a duel, that's a family that no longer has a breadwinner most of the times, right? And I mean, even when he's talking about work, like Rerum Novarum, so much of what he's saying is, how do we respect the dignity of workers so that the dignity of the family can be upheld? And the just wage and the things that we begin to, like you say, get coded as political or left-wing or all these things like this, they really are discussions about the family. That if you can't have an order that makes families flourish, downstream society starts to fall apart. And once more, I'm with you to replicate what you just said. This is not shaming about any one particular marriage and what it should look like. And I think that that's unfortunately what our current social arrangement kind of defaults to. Is like, well, we're going to talk about what a perfect marriage is and if yours isn't or not. And what we should be saying is the Catholic Church has a position about defending the capacity for families to flourish. And so it's not to like hold up an ideal of marriage and say, in a very, middle-class way, you better have a perfect marriage or else your kids are doomed, which is not what's being said. But society is, so to speak, hemmed together by families. And if you think about like what it takes to pull like a sweater apart, if you like nip one thread or another, if you get a snag in that sweater, it's not going to fall apart. But if you start pulling on the string and start pulling on all of it, the thing will unravel quickly. And so to say that the family is the building block of society, that it's an imperfect society in and of itself, that families can't, there's no primitive, like sort of libertarian families that live alone. Societies precisely are the interweaving of these families, and that it's not just the nuclear family. It's not just husband, wife, 1.5 kid, a dog, and a picket fence. This is the total expansive term of family. So not only like grandma and grandpa, all of the children, all the aunts and uncles, all of the grandchildren, all of the cousins, but even things like adoption, even things like people being grafted into other families, even talking about widows, orphans, the shut-ins, all of this starts to fall into the network of family. No one is born alone. You have to be born in a family. And even if that one passes away, if you get separated from it, if they prove to be bad parents, the order of where even the lonely or those displaced end up is in other families. And that's not to say that all relationships should be family. We can get into the maybe bosses at work should stop saying that we're a family at work, because it denigrates both the relationship of worker and workee, which are both important, and the family. But truly, we can't conceive of society except for the family. And when we displace the family as the building block, the central unit of social consideration, they're still families. They're just neglected and deprived of not, again, this sort of like, let's prize them above all things, or let's show off the best influencer families, but the very idea that societies can't flourish unless they arrange themselves to make family life flourish.
Yeah, and I think when these conversations start to happen, a lot of times it does get keyed to kind of, like I said earlier, hot button issues. And it's not that the church doesn't have an opinion. It clearly does about things like gay marriage or transgenderism. But I do feel like, the old verse, I guess all verses are old in their own way. Mm-hmm. Judgment begins with the house of God. I feel like in many ways, the way that Catholics have sometimes, or Christians in general, like thought about or practiced marriage and family life, have unwittingly kind of like laid the groundwork for some of the more controversial conversations that we have today. And what I mean by that is, and speaking very personally, I think I internalized these ideas as kind of a younger person. We've sort of romanticized marriage, and there are all sorts of factors we could get into. But you look at why marriage is established in Scripture, the way that it's talked about, and the telos or end of that relationship. And I feel like today, again, for a number of different factors, a lot of people approach that relationship as really about the subjective happiness of adults. And right. Even like the bearing and rearing of children becomes optional. If the relationship starts to not provide what you expected it to provide, you're free to break it and to seek elsewhere. And all of those things became kind of just like commonplace assumptions. And that's really like that way of approaching things has really sort of like opened the door. And now we're trying to like put the horse back in the shed, as it were. I think sort of as Christians, kind of like renewing our understanding of the purpose of marriage could really go a long ways towards having like a certain kind of witness in the world about why this institution exists. And it gets back to, like in a show about Catholic social teaching, really the question at the end of the day is like the mutual good of the spouses. Of course, that one's like should be sort of obvious to us, but also like for the good of children and for the good of the next generation. And so those other sort of, like when we talk about the unitive nature of marriage, we shouldn't sentimentalize that. It really is about helping one spouse get to heaven, to grow into holiness, and then that's oriented ultimately to the good of children. Now, there can be like reasons why a relationship doesn't end up with children, but like the natural end of the relationship is the rearing of children.
Well, and I think that, again, like you said, the one way to put this is family and marriage as a sort of lifestyle. Did you use that word, or am I picking this up from what I was reading?
I don't think I used it yet.
Okay, but I think that idea that it's a lifestyle choice, a consumer choice among many. This you're getting about like the putting adult happiness above all other concerns. That I think is what this emerges into. Is so, and like to get at what I think you were hinting at is when Catholics then defend it in a way that's like, golly gee willikers, look how happy people who are married are. First of all, there's like myriad jokes by comics about, to what degree that's true or whatever, hardy har har. But it's to miss this idea about, so that encyclical that Leo made called Arcanum Divinum, that is Latin for the divine wisdom, right? Like the ancient wisdom, the wisdom from the beginning of God in making man and woman complementary and bringing them together. I think Russell Hittinger has pointed this somewhere else that he said to improve or something, or to like riff on Aristotle's definition of humans as rational animals. They're domestic animals, right? Like we have familial heritage, right? And we're, McIntyre, we've brought this up, is they're dependent animals that we, by the very nature of how we come about, this makes us a political animal, which doesn't mean like we do politics, but polis, right? We live in cities that are constituted of families that interlace with each other in order to make society possible. And so to make anything a lifestyle that's actually essential to society being able to run and exist at all is already a huge problem. So to make the very ability for humans to exist into a lifestyle choice, that doesn't mean everyone has to do it. I mean, again, Jesus had no children, Paul had no children. Like, I think people miss this idea about natalism and thinking that the idea is just sheerly about children. But this idea of families as the way in which we, in our animal nature, depend on each other, I think that's sometimes what misses, the sentimentalizing marriage is to think about it in terms of satisfaction alone, instead of asking why it was that in our most basic biological existence, that we have families in a way that, I mean, I guess we can get into a fight, Bud, with people. Do animals have families like humans have a family? And we want to say that, like, sure, they have a lineage. And it's obviously the case that, like, different animals to different degrees care for their young. I would almost argue, though, that humans, their care for their young is uniquely something we want to call a family in its persistence into the future. Do you think that's too bold of a claim?
No.
Okay, why not?
The contrast between us and how animals organize their life.
Do you think it's like, when we say animals have a family, like, let's just do dogs. Everyone loves dogs, so let's just go for it and cause problems. Do dogs have family truly, or do we call them families by analogy? Like, we're like, oh, well, we're anthropomorphizing dogs when they say they have families. Clearly, they have lineage. Clearly, especially the mothers, but the parents take care of the young. Not denying that. Yeah. But would you say they properly have families like we do?
Well, I sort of paused when you first asked the question.
Pause.
Yeah.
Bad pun.
Because I had an example, but I was like, should I share this on air? But I will. When we've taught bioethics, we've talked about like surrogacy and sperm donation. And there's this news show that did a story of children reuniting who had never met before because one of the parents was, their dad was a sperm donor. And so there was, in California, there was this group of children who had the same father and then reconnected through like using different tools and resources and things. And when they reconnected, it was huge for them. Like they were very moved, like understanding their origins. I don't think a dog, however cute, has that impulse. I've seen a puppy reunited with like, she hadn't seen like her mom for years. And they were like excited to see each other as like two dogs are, but it wasn't like they were hugging with tears.
I love that, like, we went straight to Bud animal science. No, I'm kidding. But I mean, beyond, and that's part of it, right? The reflexive relationality and rationality.
Like the way that we view the world is refracted through that lens of our kinship network.
And better or worse, like, this is not just saying that this only works for like people who've had great families. If you've had traumatic realities in your family, it makes sense, right, why that gets carried forward so much. The whole field of psychology, in some ways, I think they write their checks because of family drama, right? And even if we want to say that, like, maybe too much emphasis placed on it, I'm not trying to get into the weeds of, like, the discourse on, like, family traumatic issues in psychology in this day. I'm just saying it's no wonder that when you have people who seek therapeutic help, a lot of that stems from very early on their relationships with their family. Surely dogs get their sort of whatever's not instinctual, like the sort of intuitions or very basic, parameters of their actions they get from imitating like dogs within their herd or whatever. They're herd animals. I understand that. But I think that's the difference, Bud. Animals can have herds. Yeah. We have families. And I know that sounds like a beyond, either it's an obvious point or it's one where you're willing to like fall on the sword and say, like, no, there's families of dogs. What I'll say is our ability to exist that way and talk about it that way, I think is sort of what we're getting about the thickness of the basic unit of society being the family. Like you said, the medium by which all human relationships are sort of socialized into us and give us that vision of what being together looks like. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Wonderful to have you with us. We were getting into fights about dogs, but no, I'm kidding. We were talking about family as the most basic unit of social reality in Catholic social teaching. Yeah. I was unfair to you and asked you kind of a question that you like asking, usually is, do any other animals have families properly? Or when we talk about the family of other animals, are we anthropomorphizing them and so using family by analogy? I think that to ask that question and to like sort of dive into it gets at the idea of like how thick of a meaning Catholic social teaching means when it talks about marriage, matrimony, the family, and its necessity in society itself. And so maybe that's shots fired or not, but I do think that even when we talk about the divine wisdom of God at the beginning to put the complementarity of man and woman and children and progeny and all of those kinship networks, that it's not mere sentimentality, it's not lifestyle choice. We do have this deep biological thing that we're bringing up that points as a sort of symbol to the spiritual reality of what we're trying to get at.
Well, and Bo, this is one area where when we talk about theology, being Catholic really expanded the way that I looked at this because the Catholic Church, I think, has an approach that stands out even from other Christian traditions. So sometimes I've had like Protestants, family members and friends say like, oh, like, can you even go to your priest for counseling on these matters? Like, what does he know? He's never been married. He's never had a family. I think celibacy for our priest listeners or other religious who listen to the show, it's one of the most important witnesses that we can give in this area. I remember at Duke Divinity School, like we had a professor who kind of pressed us like, is Jesus pro-family? Because there's kind of this idea that like living Christians maybe overemphasize this too much. You think about like a ministry like in the Protestant world, focus on the family, and it's sort of like, it almost like boils down Christianity to just this question. Mm-hmm. Whereas Christ had some interesting challenges to approaching it in that way. So, famously he said, unless you, like anyone who does not hate mother, father, brother, sister cannot be my disciple. And he has other sort of phrases or encounters with people where he pushes them. Like there's this almost like, how does he put it? Like the one who goes back to bury his loved one. Like, you're supposed to leave all that behind on behalf of the kingdom. And the network created by baptism, you get the sense of the New Testament is actually thicker than that of simply blood ties. And so that's where I think the tradition of celibacy in the Catholic Church reminds us of this like eschatological truth that family serves an important function, but it's not like the end all be all. We are not given in marriage in heaven. And that's where, so when we talk about Catholic social teaching, like one really important role of the family is to serve as this buffer or mediating institution with, governments just have this kind of like drift towards totalitarianism, and they'll take as much as like sort of we give away. And the family, just like churches or other societies, creates like a space where it's like government is not allowed to intrude. That's a really important role that the family serves. On the flip side, our families can't become these sort of like bubble wrapped, button down the hatches, keep all the dark, cold world out, where we sort of like preserve our children until the end of time. Like they are supposed to have this prophetic witness and be ways in which we connect with the least of these out in the world. And insofar as they don't do that, I think we open ourselves up to judgment.
Well, then I think kind of going off of that last point, so if people want sort of more of an insight, I think about how this family in Catholic social teaching fits into the whole enchilada of our understanding of society. My mentor, Russell Hittinger, has a article in First Things called The Three Necessary Societies. It's easy to get online. I think he gets into this well in the sort of history of why Leo XIII talked about the three that he's talking about is family, which we're talking about, polity, that even though polity can take on many different looks like democracy, monarchy, all these things, but like humans live in polises, they live together. Even someone who's like out in the woods on a farm lives in the orbit of a polis, of living in a polity with humans. And then the church, right? Those are the three necessary societies. To connect this back to something we've talked about, those three societies have to be subsidiary to each other. So to your point, if the government tries to take over the church and the family, then it's not only going outside of its bounds, but the polity that does those things undermines the ability for the society to truly stand. But conversely, if the family becomes like if the church and the government just become the idea of like an extension of a family, right? So family is really the only thing that exists. Church sort of like attends to its spiritual needs, and then the government makes sure it hasn't, the roads that families can use. Something else is drastically lost as well. And finally, this is even true with the church. The church has to be careful, right? Not to be, to fall to Satan's temptation about, bend your knee to me and I'll give you all the kingdoms of earth, right? It's one thing to say that the church took over ruling social positions because of the facts of history, but this idea of like an out-and-out theocracy of the sort of like absolutist kind is not realizing that the church has subsidiarity to polity otherwise. And then also with the family, right? Like the church, there are religious organizations that definitively see the church as completely ruling over family life, but that would miss the point about what God has set up in nature, right? That like we come together, and that's why in the West, right, priests preside over marriages, but actually the people who confect is the right word, but the official officers, officiants of the wedding are the couple that come together. And so marriage, by being the building block, right, like until you have families, and again, matrimony is a sacrament, but usually marriage is being considered in even just sort of natural marriage. So even if like the first humans didn't like go to an altar and then honeymoon in Cabo, right? Like they were married in the sort of primitive, primal way. They come about, and that's what the other two are built off of. So you have cultus, right? The religious thing that societies do, and then you have polity, which is the natural way in which these families work together. But family has to be there so that there's progeny, so that there's children, so that there's people, so there can be citizens and worshipers. None of those supervene each other, and they're subsidiary to each other. None of them are mere lifestyle choices. This is where this probably rubs like wrong in the American way, because people think you kind of could just choose your church. I know we can talk about freedom of religion later and what that means specifically in our context, but it's not the case that we believe that religion is just merely something you do and you can choose to do it or not. Even if we believe like there's a social situation where you shouldn't impose the Catholic Church on other people, that still doesn't mean that it's a mere lifestyle choice, right? And the same thing with family. Again, like we've talked about, family's not a mere lifestyle choice, and neither is polity. You have to live in one. And, finally, there's something not completely voluntary about all of those. It's not the case that we have arranged marriages or that you must live in this city or you have to go to this church, but there will be a polity. You come into this world in a family, and whether you like it, there's God, and you serve God or not. Yeah. And I think that those three sort of aspects, family, polity, and church all have, but family is the way in which we come into the world to even have that reality, that fundamental reality, real to us.
Well, I think you kind of gestured towards the biblical foundations with your first comment of the episode, and I did a matrix dodge of that question, if I remember right. But it really is like, numerous commentators have pointed out that at the start of Scripture with Genesis, that's where, Adam's loneliness is like highlighted, and God provides for him a helpmate that, there's this something that Eve provides that like no other relationship that Adam has with creation can. And then God, of course, says like, for this reason, a husband will leave a man will leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife, gives them the command to be fruitful and multiply, all these things. I think for that reason, because it's so foundational to society. Like when you talk about Satan, like attacking the foundations, like family is part of it. And some of the worst governments throughout history, like I think especially of like communist governments, like they have not only gone after people's belief in God, but also like the very existence of the family, and that maybe that the state can orchestrate the generation and rearing of children. And that's always worked out poorly. We're sort of attuned to those things. I mean, I think someone growing up like as a Catholic in the United States today can be like, oh yeah, like, you know, what the Soviet Union was trying to accomplish was terrible. What we don't see is kind of like the corrosive effects of the way our own society is structured, you know, and I don't know, I might be stealing this from Hittinger as well, but this he uses the phrase like the soft despotism of the modern state.
It's de Tocqueville, but he's talked about it.
He's used it, yeah, he's harnessed it. And, you know, like in our society, like we make it incredibly difficult for people to marry and have children. And unfortunately, like sometimes those of us who like label ourselves conservatives, we've sort of like just acquiesced to that sort of thing. And we're not willing to fight for a better approach to kind of enable people to have marriages and families. I mean, when we talk about wages and tax structures, even sort of things like we could do a whole episode on like surveillance capitalism, because we tend to think we're free to form the relationships that we want to have. And yet there's all sorts of ways in which we're being sort of like manipulated, might be too strong of a term, but like shaped to view the world in a certain way. And certainly like there's financial incentives to at least remain childless, right?
Yep.
And so as Catholics, we have to begin to think of ways where we can resist this creatively. I know we had a great interview with Holly Taylor Kuhlman recently, who talks about the kind of neighborhoods and networks that you have to have in parishes to sort of empower people to do this sort of thing. Without that kind of witness, it's just going to, you know, I don't want to blame like sin or shortcomings on just like, well, these social structures made me do it. But I think it does require a great deal of sacrifice to have a sort of openness to life and to say even, you know, like I think it's harder for my oldest daughter's 17 now. When I think about them reaching their early to mid 20s, it's going to be harder for them to marry than it was for me.
Well, and I mean, I want to make an expansive, but two things come to mind immediately. So obviously, because of certain people running for vice president and things they said, the specter of talking about whether people should have children or not has caused all sorts of division, and people fall into their normal trenches, and it's like World War I, and no one's making any progress anywhere. Let me point out that I think what we really should be talking about, whether family and children are set up to flourish in our society, is not to say every single person who can have a child needs to. And I mean that both men and women, right? So it's not to say that if you're not a priest or if you're not religious, you better be producing children, you know, and what to me is a sort of, it's a character straight out of The Handmaid's Tale, which I've heard too many people in my life say that that's almost upon us, which to me is an interesting take. But what I'm getting at, is there's a way to be like an aunt or an uncle who doesn't end up getting married and having your own kids that is very much a part of the family and pro raising children. Mm-hmm. So I think that like people misunderstand that. Certainly in traditional societies, not every aunt and uncle got married and had kids, but they lived the sort of life where every kid in that family had a relationship in some way to the extended aunts and uncles as well. And there was abusive families and people were bad to each other. I'm not glorifying that in any way. So there's all sorts of things that like we're better off than we used to be. However, it is to say that a person who is not currently married or in a vocation, religious or priestly, that if they think like, well, I'm not really childless, because of course I am part of the family that raises these children, that's a very different world. And I think that sometimes Catholics do a bad job of only talking about having children or childlessness in terms of the nuclear family, which actually goes against this much wider, deeper, thicker net of family life that we actually are arguing for. But then conversely, your point about, I think it was great to say, like, we're very attuned to, like, if the state decides to go full Plato's Republic and, breeds children without having parents and no one ever knows their parents, it's collectively done. You're absolutely right. But I think sometimes people forget how much in the sort of free market societies that we have, that televisions and marketers and phones raise children, and that there's a way in which the collectivism that they were worried about getting messages from like one central area, guys, like basically there's only 5 companies on earth and everyone else is sort of a subsidiary of one of those 5 companies, 5 to 7 to 10, whoever you talk to. And if you mostly give your children over to those messages, it's pretty collectivist, bud. I even like to point this out, that when you get something like Leo the 13th and Rerum Novarum sort of arguing for what people would talk about as economic distributism, we can get into that because those are a lot of weeds. But generally this idea that he's worried, he's a very agricultural guy. He's not like in Germany at the time that's really industrial. He is an Italian. So when people are talking about taking private property, he's like, why would you take people's farms? Because he's like, people should have land that they can, supply the need of their families. So, look, people were very worried about the collectivization of agriculture. And let's be honest, the communists blew this time and again. And I don't even think Marx himself thought you should collectivize agriculture like they did, but that's a whole other, like me being a historical nerd. Russia blew it. China blew it. Everybody who tried to collectivize agriculture has blown it, except one force, bud. Capitalism is doing a great job collectivizing farms. And people go, what are you talking about? Hold up. Look, industrial farms being sort of collectivized under like Monsanto and these big companies that are, but that's collectivism. Just because they're not, Mao doesn't mean that the worry we have about people having a sort of confederation of means to take care of families, that's the worry. And so if you think it's possible for an economic and social order to take that away from families, it doesn't matter if it's this ideology or the other. That has to be the question, and it comes back to what is the economy for? Is it for the family, the polity, and the church, or are those 3 things so that the economy runs well? And I think what the Catholic social teaching, by hammering again and again families as the basic building blocks, and that idea being much more expansive than just the nuclear family, like the whole thread and interweaving of family life, is to say economics must take a second seat to families. If an economy is doing something where families, by subsidiarity, cannot take care of themselves, society must ask the economy to change. That doesn't mean that it has to revolutionarily change, but to get to your point, whatever we're doing as a society that makes young people not imagine life in family, whether that is as an uncle and aunt or like mom and dad, anything that makes it where that seems impossible or hard to do is something we must take upon ourselves and ask, should it be changed?
Okay. That's all great stuff. I'm tempted to give another thought about that, but I want to pivot real quickly because I know we're up against almost the end of the show.
Right.
And you asked me a difficult question about animal families. What are your thoughts about the phrase, the domestic church? I think John Paul II did use this term. I see some strengths, but possibly potential misunderstandings. I don't know. You likey?
Well, I mean, I think it makes sense in its time because when you're trying to talk about like holiness being, the universal call to holiness, and something that could be seen as lost, because if you make clergy and religious like the professional class and they're professionally holy and then we're just sort of like praying and throwing money in the plate, I understand completely that you start to go, no. I mean, he's making a play off the fact that the earliest churches were house churches, domestic ecclesia, right? And I think even he's making a very specific idea to say, no, like the church, yes, they had clergy from the beginning, but it was the people of God, right? And so just as there's the people of God, there's also the domestic church. The church, so to speak, the worship of God starts in the home. And so I think in that way, and being very specific to the time and place, especially that John Paul II was responding to, and making that sort of pointing to the historical reality of the church, I like it there. I'm with you that when it becomes unmoored from those conversations, it can really make it sound like, well, the actual parish is just sort of an afterthought. What really happens is in the domestic church. But again, if you think about society as having 3 necessary societies within it, and they're subsidiary to each other, I think we avoid that and get to the best of that term.
Yeah, I think there are some strengths when you draw like analogies. And so the family's meant to be prayerful. It's ordered to our sanctification. Like I said earlier, it's not turned in on itself. So all those things, like we kind of, by analogy, we see the church and we understand some of the elements of family life. But then again, there are things that the church provides that the family can't, most obviously like the sacraments of the Holy Eucharist and reconciliation. That gets into, as a father, like I have some grounds for like blessing my children like it's proper to my station in life. But it's not like a priestly, it's different in kind than a priestly blessing.
Absolutely. And like the way in which the family is the site of the universal priesthood of all believers, which is different than the clerical priesthood.
Sacramental priesthood.
Sacramental priesthood. Well, this is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, a wonderful rumination on, like I said, something that should seem obvious, but I really do think a fundamental way in which the foundation of society works, to think about marriage, family life, and how all that goes. Before we forget, just to make a correction all the way back at the beginning of the show, just because we brought up Indiana Jones, and we should see this through. It was about the Holy Grail, but the name of the movie was The Last Crusade.
Yeah, it's funny because as you age, you have these mental freezes or whatever. And in normal life, like it's not a huge deal. Like you can sort of just like tell your children to be more patient with you. But on air sometimes, and I just couldn't, like I had that mental space. Like they say it's on the tip of your tongue.
Yeah, I know.
When you said Holy Grail, I was like, it is about the Holy Grail, but that's actually part of a Monty Python title.
That's true. What else I'm also for is the prayer life we have on Iowa Catholic Radio.
Well, the new times for our prayer life are more difficult for me to remember, but I think they are designed to really connect with persons of all, how do I say it? Like, there's the morning person and then there's the night owl. If you're a morning person, serious morning person, you can pray the rosary with us at 4:30 a.m. But if you're mid-morning and like you've got to start to your day, but you need some time away, a break for prayer, 10 a.m.
Nice.
And then in the evening or late at night for some folks, not so much for myself, 8:30 p.m. So 4:30 a.m., 10 a.m., and 8:30 p.m.
Which one of those are for the Temple of Doom types?
I'm not sure. I mean, you can also use the app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere. So we've got you covered.
We've got it covered in all sorts of ways. Of course, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com and click on events to see what is up in and around the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area. So, for instance, October 19th at Cedar Rapids, we have Veterans Memorial Building, the Awaken Iowa. So if you happen to be listening to us when we were doing the fall fundraiser, we got to talk to one of the people, a local Iowa, Des Moines boy who was running that. So it's at 6 p.m. If you guys are over in Cedar Rapids. Then November 1st in West Des Moines, we have First Friday Mass at the radio station. November 16th, the Born to Run 5K and 1 mile fun run, which I will not be doing, but you could. April 2nd, this is going to be to be determined, but a big one, an evening with Father Mike Schmitz. So people will, I know, will want to keep an eye out for that. We want to say thank you to everybody who gave to the fall fundraiser. And it's not too late. Just because you didn't happen to have stuff ready to go during the fall fundraiser doesn't mean you should throw up your hands and say that you can't donate. We are willing to even sort of wink and nod at you, counting it. I'll say in my heart it was for the fall fundraiser. But of course, this ministry is not just the folks on air, behind the mics, behind the board, behind the desks. It is your ministry as well. It doesn't exist except that we're all in this together to spread the word of the Lord through the auspices and medium of radio. You make that happen through your prayers, through your volunteer times, but very definitely you make it happen through your material gifts that make it possible for us to be on the air, over the airwaves, and just be this blessing for people who happen to run into our stations or intend to go there, whether that be, like we said, online, on the airwaves, through podcast, etc. Thank you for everyone who gives, and please prayerfully consider to keep giving to make this continue to happen. Bud, I think we made a show that if we played it to our wives, they would say, we understand a little about marriage at least.
Yeah, I'll have to run this one by Rachel and see if it gets the seal of approval.
We'll see. We'll see if they have time in their busy schedules to
That's right.
listen to little less. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.